Great to see so many people joining in. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, and I'm really delighted to help host this event with the Washington Office on Latin America. I will not be talking about the substance, but just quickly going over the technology we'll be using. I know all of us have been in Zoom webinars before, but we have enabled the interpretation. If you would like to listen to the simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, you can find that at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A is where we will take questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We have also enabled the chat function for audience members to talk amongst themselves. We really look forward to this conversation. I will turn it over now to Annie Shield, the director of the U.S. program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks for having us. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am honored to be able to facilitate today's discussion with excellent experts who I will introduce momentarily. But first, this event is marking a somber occasion. Nearly 1 year of U.S. boat strikes against civilians in the Caribbean and Pacific, killing over 220 people. These strikes taken outside of armed conflict and against people simply accused of committing the crime of drug trafficking are extrajudicial killings or murder, plain and simple. And they also represent the truly frightening assertion from this administration that the government can kill anyone they accuse of a crime without due process. And so given the significant gravity of this issue, I am grateful for today's panelists for joining us to speak about the boat strikes, what we know, and what comes next. They include Adam Isacson, who directs WOLA's Defense Oversight Program and has worked on defense, security, and peace building in Latin America since 1994. María Teresa Ronderos, a reporter and editor, as well as the founder and director of El Centro Latinoamericano de Investigación Periodística, el CLIP, a nonprofit investigative reporting organization focused on abuse of power in the Americas, and Sarah Harrison, a lawyer who is currently a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center and formerly an associate general counsel at the Department of Defense's Office of General Counsel. So I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to talk about the facts. What do we know about the strikes so far? What patterns can we discern? What do we know about the victims? And how are the strikes being justified? And as a reminder, as we go, you can put any questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. Adam, we will start with you. WOLA has closely tracked the strikes. What can you tell us about the patterns that have emerged?
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, everybody, for organizing and joining this event. WOLA tried to summarize a lot of what we know in a report that we put out on July 24th called Killing Spree, which is exactly what this was. But okay, just what we know. First of all, maritime drug interdiction is like a 40-plus-year-old mission for the Defense Department since Congress made it the single lead agency for overseas drug interdiction. That has meant a law enforcement mission. No use of lethal force unless there's been like an immediate self-defense justification, mainly Coast Guard operations, sometimes using warning shots, sometimes disabling engines of boats, but very few dead. Hundreds of tons of drugs seized each year, people on boats arrested and becoming information sources and using evidence. But when we're talking about drugs here, we're talking about cocaine coming from South America. This has always been sort of an underfunded program, too. In 2020, the commander of Southern Command said that he only had funds to interdict 9% of total maritime drug movement. But then the boat strikes changed this calculus, going lethal and broadcasting every killing on Twitter with videos of the people on boat not knowing that they were about to be blown up, being blown up. And we have now seen 63 such videos broadcast to social media, the destruction of 67 boats, killing at least 221 people when you add up what is summarized in the tweets and the social media messages. Of those 221, at least 23 initially survived and then were drowned or otherwise died. 2 more had survived and were clinging to the wreckage on September 2nd when the Defense Department green-lighted a second strike to kill the shipwrecked survivors called the double tap strike. 3 other survivors were indeed rescued. None of them were ever charged with any crimes. At least 2 of them have been returned to their home countries. So 28 out of 224 people total were actually not killed instantly by these attacks. They died not instant death, but much more horrible death, often of drowning. Now, there have been 44 strikes that we know of in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, 17 strikes in the Caribbean Sea, 2 in unspecified locations. And we're not even talking about here about the strikes that made some news last week in the New York Times and the Washington Post in the Eastern Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos, where in January and March, what the Post is reporting may have been the CIA was involved in attacks on fishing boats that most people survived. That's a very bizarre, mysterious case that's still not cleared up, but it's not what we're talking about today. The boat strikes have kind of been in a lull. The last strike was June 21st. Venezuela had its devastating double earthquakes on June 24th, and Southern Command had to play a big role in initial search and rescue and rebuilding operations. So there have not been boat strikes for almost 2 months, but there's been no definitive stop. They could resume at any time. There's been no rescinding of the orders that enabled these strikes to begin. And in fact, we're seeing sort of a change in form, perhaps, of the campaign into part of a larger effort that's going to move, if the Defense Department gets its way, to land attacks. The joint task force that had been created last November to oversee these boat strikes, called Joint Task Force Southern Spear, has been disbanded. And Southern Spear is now part of something larger called Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere. This happened at the beginning of August. And the Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere is headed by a 2-star Marine general, which does indicate that it's going to be less of a purely maritime mission. The mission and measures of effectiveness of what was Southern Spear were classified. We don't know the mission. We don't know how they're measuring success. Their targeting criteria, classified. Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere now is operating, and 5 countries, if Secretary Hegseth announced last week, have agreed to some form of joint operations within their territory involving U.S. personnel, which could involve land attacks. Those are Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, and now Colombia, which is going to get about $1 billion in military assistance. A campaign plan is being drawn up for this, and there will be a new meeting in Miami in November to really formally launch this joint operations framework. So the boat strikes, while they may continue, could be some part of something much larger. Just in terms of cost, since November 2025 through the end of June, the Department of Defense had spent about $821 million just on the boat strike campaign. So we're probably well over $1 billion total just for this component. I'm not even counting like the operations in Venezuela or elsewhere. The entire presence of U.S. military personnel in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific and in Venezuela from August through March cost about $4.7 billion when you put it all together, according to the Brown University Cost of War project. To take out the boats, they've been using, according to the New York Times best guesses, educated guesses, MQ-9 Reaper drones, AC-130J Ghost Rider gunships, glide bombs, laser-guided missiles, and probably mostly running out of bases in Puerto Rico and in El Salvador, where there's a cooperative security location at the Comalapa Airport outside San Salvador. And, there's just a lot of questions about targeting and the intelligence being used to decide whom to kill. It's enough to be considered by the Defense Department to be affiliated with groups on a secret list of designated terrorist organizations that the Defense Department maintains but does not share. Affiliation is not defined. You could be 3 degrees of separation away from one of the organized crime groups that the Trump administration has added to its list of terrorist groups. So there's a very high probability that people who have nothing to do with the drug trade are being targeted. But even if they were, this should not be a death sentence. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Adam, for all of that important information. I want to talk next about what we know about the victims of the strikes. Maria Teresa, I'll go to you. What do we know about the victims of the strikes, and why has it been so challenging to understand who is being killed?
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I'm going to share a little bit my screen. I hope it works. Can you see it?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. So I'll start with the findings So we did this investigation with CLIP, with the Latin American Center for Investigative Reporting on the bombs, between September and May this year. And we found out that a lot of the victims came from Uribia in Colombia, which is the northern coast in Colombia, Pedernales from the Dominican Republic, Guiria, a little town in the coast of Venezuela, Caribbean coast, and the Pacific coast from Colombia and Ecuador, and from tiny towns around there. All of them with poverty rates over 80% of people poor in these places, and very little jobs. We were able to ascertain, at least with all the sources we went into, known owned drugs. There were no kingpins, no people who were like the bosses of the drug, contrary to what has been sort of announced. At least in 3 occasions, the bombed boats were probably not carrying drugs, either because they had too many passengers, like the first one, which had about 11 passengers, and another one which had 6 passengers. But also, we found at least one boat that was going the other way around. It was going inland, so it didn't make any sense that it was carrying drugs in a different way. This is not. These are some of the people we were able to identify. These are some of the men, all of them young, all of them poor. None of them, or most of them, were not full-time smugglers of drugs or cocaine. Most of them just did odd jobs, transported contraband goods or people, or sometimes they were motor taxi drivers or bus drivers. Or we even found a fantastic story of a guy who was famous for playing football, and everybody misses him a lot. And there was a lot of outcry in the social networks because he was a very loved person. And the US, as you know, has not acknowledged knowing who they killed. They just said that the boats, according to their intelligence, the boats had some association with supposedly cartels, as Adam said. Many of these people, we were able to identify 19 people with, let me show you, 19 people that we were able to show their faces. Of the 3 who were injured, we were also to identify them. One of them, and who survived, 2 of them were sent to the local prosecutor's office, but they couldn't try them or do anything with them because there was no evidence against them. All the evidence was gone. And we couldn't, and one of them, as far as we know, is still in a hospital in Costa Rica, severely burnt, and it has not been possible for us to talk to him. Regarding your second question, which had to do with the difficulties, well, we did a huge screen in 5 countries. In this report, we had allies from different media in Colombia, Casa Macondo, Verdad Abierta, 360 Degrees, and from Venezuela, the ARI, and the Guardian from Trinidad Tobago, and we also had the support of Airworks, the British organization. And so our problems that we had, we did all kinds of interview. We went to several of these little towns in the Pacific, in Venezuela, and in the Caribbean, in Colombia. We had reporters in Mexico, in Costa Rica, trying to find out the remains of these people. And it was incredibly difficult to piece together these stories. Finally, we were able to talk to some of family, people who knew them, people from organizations, priests, that kind of local sources. We also sent all kinds of official requests for information, and most of it just came back empty. Most sources asked to be anonymous because they were really, really scared. A lot of the victims said that they were being threatened. Of course, some are being threatened by the narcos themselves who rule on some of these towns, but others are being threatened by governments saying you cannot speak. And a lot of official officers, public officers that we talked in embassies and in prosecutors' offices, they said, no, we can't talk because we're going to get our government into trouble. We're going to get retaliation by Trump and so on and so forth. A lot of the prosecutor offices didn't open, as I said, formal investigations. So it was impossible for us to look at these files, at the court files or anything like that, except for the two cases that were brought to the United States, that there was some evidence collected and we talked to those lawyers. Everything else was not possible. The other findings, I think I'm going to leave it there, and maybe in the next round I can talk about other findings related to the impact of this investigation.
Thank you so much, María Teresa, and thank you for your and your colleagues' extraordinary investigations into this. It's really so critical. Sarah, I'm going to go to you next. Can you talk a little bit about how the Trump administration is justifying these strikes? How should we understand the legal rationale?
Sure. Thank you, Annie. And thank you, Jeff, for organizing this. So the Trump administration is claiming they're in a war. And when a country's at war with an enemy, whether it's a non-state group or a state, they can use lethal force as a first resort. But it's not really up for debate whether these boat strikes are legal. They are illegal, they are extrajudicial killings, and they are murder under domestic law. Even if we accept all the facts that the president's putting forward, that these boats are carrying drugs and are bringing them to the United States, there is no basis in the law to execute the individuals on these boats. So a government can use lethal force in two instances as a first resort. One, like I said, is when a government is at war or in self-defense of either the country or of individuals. So I'll take the first. These boat strikes are not being conducted in the context of an armed conflict. The president is trying to claim there is an armed conflict so he can use force as a first resort, but as a factual matter, which is how you determine if there's an armed conflict between a state and a non-state group, an armed conflict doesn't exist between any Latin American group and the United States. And these labels of terrorism, which the president and his cabinet keep reiterating, don't change that. So when Secretary Hegseth says they are like ISIS, they are like Al-Qaeda, we can go after them like our enemies, the legal framework here is distinct and categorically different from the framing of the post 9/11 wars. Those wars did expand in ways that I think logically have led to this expansion of use of lethal force against groups that the president labels terrorists, but it's not the same. And I think it's intentional to confuse the public to continually use the post 9/11 terrorist framing on these criminal groups. And so what the president's doing here, to just be very frank, he's lying. He's lying to the public. He's fabricating this war, armed conflict in an attempt to avoid all of the legal constraints that apply during peacetime. And that includes the human rights law and murder statutes, due process. And so this is an attempt to get around those constraints to use lethal force as a first resort. Now, there's not a war, so he can't use that as an excuse. There's also these strikes are not being taken in self-defense. We'll take the first argument that there has been an armed attack by these criminal organizations against the United States. It has never been ever a legal opinion of scholars or governments that organized criminal networks conducting their criminal activities like drug trafficking constitutes the level of a grave use of force that would be an armed attack under international law. Under the UN Charter, states have a right to use force in self-defense if there is an armed attack, but that is a high standard to meet. And criminal networks and activities of drug trafficking do not meet that, and it would not permit the use of lethal force in self-defense. And neither has there been an imminent threat to human life or serious bodily injury, which would be the requirement for use of lethal force in self-defense of individuals. And we know this because Secretary Rubio and others have said, we can interdict these boats. We can do what we've been doing, as Adam described, using the Coast Guard to interdict and arrest. But we're not. We're choosing to do this as a way to deter these individuals from trafficking drugs. And so, they are making it very clear that there is no lethal action being taken in self-defense of individuals. And even if the Coast Guard did interdict the people in these boats, assuming they had drugs on board and DOJ prosecuted them, there is no provision in the law for capital punishment, in US law for capital punishment for trafficking drugs. So the government couldn't even execute them even after all the due process that is legally required to be provided. So to make this very simple, what the military is doing is they are executing alleged criminal suspects. The US government can't do that on the streets of the United States. They can't walk up to an individual in Miami who they know is carrying drugs and put a bullet in their head. They cannot do that. That is like black and white illegal. It is the same thing. That what they are doing to these boats is the same exact thing as executing someone on the streets. The only difference is miles, right? The only difference is that they are miles off the coast of the United States. As a legal matter, it's murder, it's extrajudicial killings. And it sounds shocking that the US military is conducting mass murder on the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific, because it is shocking. It is shocking that DOD is murdering people at the behest of the president. And we can talk further in the next round about where to go from here as a matter of law.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for laying that all out so clearly. I want to focus next on the implications of these strikes, now that you all have kind of laid out what it is that we know so far, both in the US and also in the region and across the world. María Teresa, I'd like to start with you this time. What have these strikes meant for communities in Latin America? How are they being perceived? How are they affecting communities?
Sorry, you need to put my video on because I can't do it. Somebody else did it. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so what we were able to see during the investigation is that it had a huge impact on very poor communities, especially fishing communities that are all around those coasts, because people were incredibly scared. So some of them for weeks didn't go out for fishing. And of course, people went hungry. In some of the cases, one of the parishes had to ask for food from Bogota to be able to feed people because people were going hungry. There was also other kinds of impacts like disruptions that we were able to document. At least 18 flights, commercial flights going over Colombia, seriously disrupt, or at least complicated disruptions because the GPS went off. And even though there's redundancy in the systems, in some of the cases, those redundancies are not working. And that's why it could have been a hazardous situation for the flight. So that was something that was not known at all. And the other thing that a lot of people are questioning here is why, when you do the regular operations we've been talking about, we actually compare the regular operations vis-a-vis these operations. And it's not that they stopped the regular operations of interdiction and only did this. They were running them side by side. And the other ones, the regular ones, they were doing them with the governments of several countries, and they actually had much better results in many ways. They even one of these operations, a lot of them were happening even on the 2nd of September, exactly the same day, and very close. So what was the criteria for blowing up some boats, and then bigger boats that were going just miles apart from the boats that were blown up? They just let them go. Most of them were going towards Europe, which is another question that people are asking and saying, why are they supposedly, the US, involved in this? A lot of these drugs are not going to the United States, are going to Europe. So they let, with intelligence from the US, go these boats all the way closer to European islands, and then they were stopped and people were put in jail and all of these, arrested and ordinary things. So and even one of the cases led to the arresting of a big drug dealer in Greece. So I think that there is a lot of bewilderment of why people did this. Now, there's not a lot of public discussion because, as I said, there's a lot of fear. People fear, governments fear, even the government of Colombia, the previous government that decided to make it out in the open and received one of the survivors of one of these bombings and said that, and visited him in his house and did a big thing about it. Then he had a very big retaliation from the government and from President Trump. So they just got scared. Everybody's shut up. Nobody's talking about this. We talked off the record with at least two sources in different foreign relations offices in Colombia and in Dominican Republic, and both said, we'll keep this thing as quiet as we can. We don't want to fuss. We don't want to make an issue about this, even though their citizens were being killed, as Rani said, as Sarah said, in a completely illegal way. So yeah, I would say that that was more or less what we saw as an impact to the whole region. And of course, it opens a very complicated door for extrajudicial killings in countries like Colombia, when we are just starting to have justice of over about 14,000 extrajudicial killings during the conflict. And this sort of gives like we say in Spanish, patente de corso, like an open, like justifiable that you can go out and do, because since the US is doing it, why not the rest of the government? So that is also a very scary impact that could follow.
Thank you so much, Maria Teresa. It's very clear from your comments that the consequences are very far-reaching across the region. Adam, I want to go to you next to ask about what we know about the impacts of the strikes inside the United States. As you and others have noted, they've been ostensibly framed as a counter-drug trafficking effort. Have they been effective? What do we know about the impact inside the US?
Yeah, we've been looking at that, and it's been 11 months since 11 and a half months now since the boat strikes began. And okay, the New York Times and the Washington Post have both looked at available data, talked to experts on availability of cocaine in US cities. The Washington Post actually got some leaked information from DEA. Now, if there actually was effectiveness in reducing the supply of cocaine because of these boat strikes, just like at the gas pump right now, when something gets scarcer, it gets more expensive, right? Supply and demand 101. Or it would get less pure also, as dealers use other fillers to try to stretch the product. DEA, these experts, in US markets, the street price of cocaine has not changed. The purity has not changed. Almost a year later, there's no evidence that the law of supply and demand has kicked in at all, or that there's been an appreciable effect on drug supplies. We also have 11 months of data now from Customs and Border Protection, CBP, our border agency, which reports their seizures of cocaine at the Mexico and Canadian borders, as well as anything they have going at coasts and airports. Looking at the 11 months before the strikes began, October of 24 through August of 25, and then comparing that to the 11 months since the strikes began, CBP has actually seized 1% more cocaine in the post-boat strike era, which tells me it's a rough measure, but it tells me that cocaine is passing through this maritime gauntlet of the boat strikes as well as it ever has, and making its way much closer to the United States, to its actual borders. 1% more cocaine, despite 221 people being killed, civilians being killed to try to stop it. And why might there be? Well, really, all the boat strikes have done, if they're deterring anything, they've deterred small boat cocaine trafficking on the high seas. Well, that's just one of many ways that cocaine can make its way to the United States. It can go inside of shipping containers on cargo ships. It can go in submarines or semi-submersible watercraft, I'm sorry. But, like handmade submarines, of which many have been interdicted over the years. Small boats making short hops near coasts rather than going on the open seas, which does happen quite a bit. Transshipment overland. Look at all the migrants who were smuggled from South America through the Darien Gap to the Mexico border during the so-called border crisis of the Biden years. Human beings are harder to conceal than drugs, yet so many of them made it through checkpoints, etc., to get to the United States. Riverine routes, aerial routes, there is a number of ways that drugs can still move. So this carnage has happened really just to deter one form of trafficking, and it's not even clear how well that has worked. Meanwhile, we have to remember that as Senator Tim Kaine, who's the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Subcommittee for the Western Hemisphere, has had a look. He's done some very good oversight, and he's had a look at the documents having to do with this, and he discovered that apparently there are 3 criteria that the Defense Department is using to determine whether to attack a boat. We don't know what they are, but Kaine has revealed that whether there are drugs on the boat at all is not one of those criteria, which is pretty darn remarkable. So Kaine, as well as Senator Adam Schiff and Rand Paul from Kentucky and others, tried last October to use the War Powers resolution to disapprove of this entire mission and get the Senate to vote against it. They lost last October by a 48-51 vote. Senator Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Paul of Kentucky voted with the Democrats, and the Democrats lost John Fetterman to the Republicans, so it was a very party line. A similar resolution failed 210 to 216 in the House back in December. So that is the extent of the pushback that we've seen legislatively against the boat strikes, other than many outrage letters and a lot of good oversight from Senator Kaine and a few other members of Congress.
Thank you so much, Adam, for demonstrating how the strikes are not only, morally abhorrent and unlawful, but also ineffective and counterproductive. I want to move now to the global level. And Sarah, I'll turn to you. What are some of the global implications? And in particular, how should we think about international legal accountability for these unlawful strikes?
Sure. Obviously, first and foremost, these strikes undermine international law, but also the application of human rights domestically in the United States. And it continues to undermine this and really obliterate this line that should be quite stark between war and peacetime, where peacetime is our norm. This is how we apply our laws, is typically under a peacetime framework, and war is the exception. The US has just continually been on this war footing, even though this is not a war. It just continues to obliterate that because the president is asserting that he's at war and can kill. It's obviously an extension as well of the president's complete disregard for international law, as we've seen in Iran and in Venezuela, and what we are anticipating in Cuba. I think one way to right the ship, an important way to right the ship, is to pursue accountability. First and foremost, states have the responsibility to hold their officials accountable, their own officials accountable. And if they don't do that, which they could, a future administration could hold Trump officials and US military leaders accountable for these strikes, for these murders, under Title 18, which is it's a code. It's in the U.S. Code, and it has a murder statute and a conspiracy to commit murder statute, and then also the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which could try military officers. If the U.S. doesn't do that, there are ways internationally to hold U.S. officials accountable for this. Foreign courts, I'll just kind of tick through them because there's several ways. Foreign courts whose nationals are being killed, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, they could like quietly collect evidence and not make a big to-do of it, and someday try U.S. officials for murder of their nationals. Many states don't have a statute of limitations or have a quite long statute of limitations on their murder statutes. I'll talk at the end about the hurdles to all of these accountability measures and some of the benefits as well. Then there are courts that don't have a victim involved, that's their national, the perpetrators aren't their nationals, and the crime didn't occur on their territory, but they have a universal jurisdiction statute. And that statute would allow them to try foreign officials for committing atrocity crimes like war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, typically those three. Now, there have been legal scholars, and I agree with them, who have put out very convincing analysis that the boat strikes are crimes against humanity. So they are atrocity crimes. They're just not war crimes. They're CAH, or crimes against humanity. And so these foreign courts would have jurisdiction to try them under their universal jurisdiction statute for CAH. There's also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Any decision from the commission would be non-binding on the United States. There was a complaint filed by a Colombian victim's family earlier this year asking for payment and also for the extrajudicial killings to stop. The U.S. has been very hostile towards the commission since earlier this year. They held a hearing on this, like the legal issues related to the boat strikes. So we can imagine they would be very hostile to the commission if they found jurisdiction for this complaint and went forward with making any findings. There's also the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, two separate bodies that do very different things. The ICJ will hear cases about actions of states. And so there are two ways to do this. There's contentious cases, but they would need consent from the United States, which they're not going to get. But they could issue an advisory opinion at the request of the General Assembly. So if there's a state in the General Assembly that really wants to push for an advisory opinion at the ICJ on the legality of these strikes, they could do that. It would be non-binding, but it would be incredibly influential in international law. It would be a huge deal if the General Assembly did that, and if the ICJ went forward and issued an opinion. And then the International Criminal Court, which would be real accountability for officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. So they could have jurisdiction for crimes against war crimes. Crimes against humanity, CAH. They could have jurisdiction over CAH here because some of these boats are likely registered with parties that are states that are a party to the Rome Statute, and that would give a jurisdictional hook, both the crime and the boat's registration. Obviously, the U.S. has been very hostile towards the court for many years. It's not just under the Trump administration. They have just taken it to new levels. And have made it very clear that they are going to do everything they can. They just put out a statement, I believe yesterday, that they are going to do everything they can to dismantle the court and are trying to get Latin American countries to withdraw from the Rome Statute. I think because they are actually quite afraid of accountability measures against them, Rubio, Hegseth, Trump, et cetera, for the crimes that they're committing. So they're quite transparent about wanting to dismantle the mechanisms of justice in the international community, because I think they feel very comfortable that with the immunity decision from the Supreme Court and the pardon power of the president, they'll be in the clear here at home. So there are hurdles to all of this. There's the ability to arrest, quite difficult, ability to collect evidence, quite difficult. And then I think probably the biggest challenge of all is the political will of any of these bodies, whether it's a domestic court or an international court or an international commission. The upsides are, I think, outweigh the downsides, and it's upholding international law, pursuing justice, and really pushing for a world in which people who commit mass murder are held accountable, and we deter that type of activity. I'll end with the fact that Duterte, who used to run the Philippines, he was head of the Philippines, he said once that, you know, he would never be held accountable for the crimes that he committed there. And he's sitting in The Hague for the exact crimes that the US is committing right now, which is extrajudicial killings of alleged criminal suspects. So it can happen, it just takes time. And my hope is that time favors justice for these victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for all of that. I have one more question for all of you before we go to the audience Q&A. So again, a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them very shortly. But my final question for you all before we go to the audience is about where should we go from here? And so I'd like each of you to just speak to a few recommendations for what you think we need to see, whether that's from the administration, from Congress, from the international community, from civil society, etc. You've already mentioned a few of them, but what are some of the key recommendations that the audience should take away from today? I will start. Yes, María Teresa, you came off. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Well, one of the things I think that the media could do, and we are trying certainly to do, is to keep trying to put names and stories to these persons so that they're not like criminals or whatever name the administration is giving them, you know, drug dealers, narco terrorists, whatever. They're persons with a story, with a family. And I think if we're able to name these people, and I think if a lot, we are trying to do a campaign now, trying to get those names, more stories of people, because at least if we get them on the record, this will help the whole processes, the judicial processes. If prosecutors in the future would want to go into this and try to understand what happened and try to hold the U.S. government or U.S. officials responsible for these killings, I think they would need all this documentation. So I think from the point of view of the media, we can do a lot by telling these stories in a much more detailed way and really giving a human face to all these people. Also, on the other hand, I think there's a lot of fear around a lot of public officers, but as I was hearing Sarah, I think they could be collecting a lot of information more quietly in order to be able to act maybe later. I think that this is something that will see justice in the future. I don't think it will go and it will be forgotten. So and it's our role, that civil society and journalists and media and prosecutors, and that we don't let it be forgotten, so that those who carried out these orders and who did this are accountable, because this was like a massive amount of people who were killed. Many of them were not even dealing drugs, and even if they were, they should have had their day in court. So that's what I believe can be done. Maybe it's not so optimistic about current moment, but as you say, Annie, and I think Sarah said, regarding thinking about Duterte, we thought it couldn't be done, and now he is facing justice. And in our own country, in Colombia, my own country, we thought all of these killings were not going to be ever judged, and now they're being judged, and those responsible have to face the people. So I do think that it's maybe it's a time to just collect the information, report on it, and go deeper to get the full picture.
Thank you so much, María Teresa. Adam, I see you coming on camera. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, might as well. And yeah, I mean, just to underline what Maria Teresa said, I mean, we may not be in an accountability moment here in the United States right now, sad to say, but we can take actually a lot of inspiration from Colombian human rights groups who diligently recorded and archived the abuses committed during the armed conflict there, and whose work became really the corpus that subsequent tribunals and truth commissions worked with. And so we have to be documenting as much as we can. Until then, I mean, what there is going to be a change. It may be because of an election outcome or some shift in opinion here in the United States. But once it is possible, the Defense Department immediately has to halt all boat strikes. I mean, it should halt them now, no matter what. But it's not an easy push with this Defense Department. It must rescind all orders enabling the boat strikes. At the earliest opportunity, we need to make public, ideally to the public or at least to Congress, this secret Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel memo that is legalizing the boat strikes. That is a classified document still. It appears to have a really preposterous argument in it saying that this is not murder because the United States is in an armed conflict, but it's a special kind of armed conflict where the Congress doesn't have to declare war because this doesn't count as hostilities, which is like Cirque du Soleil levels of contortion legally, but it's what they're relying on, and we have not been able to see this document. We haven't been able to see the execute order that lays out targeting decisions. We haven't been able to see the mission statement or the measures of effectiveness. We haven't seen the full video of the double tap strike on September 2nd, or descriptions of all of the strikes so far. The criteria for targeting, etc. There's so much transparency that we still need, and that a future Congress or U.S. administration, or this one under intense pressure, will have to divulge. Probably a future Justice Department, one that maybe has its independence from the White House once again customarily restored, will have to carry out a full criminal investigation. Even if President Trump has pardoned many of those involved in the future, an investigation that would include testimony from the relatives of the victims whose stories need to be told, as Maria Teresa said, to determine criminal responsibilities and refer things to the U.S. justice system. Congress has to keep trying with war powers resolutions or funding cutoffs. They need to do a lot of hearings, especially if there is a change in the majority in either or both houses, to look into possible violations of U.S. law, to look into command and policy responsibilities for these violations of law, to look at the decision-making and institutional failures that led to this happening and how we can avoid them ever happening again. There's a lot of work and oversight that Congress should be doing, and it absolutely has failed to do so far. And, other recommendation to other nations is to stay away from this operation. Keep your distance, because as Sarah was intimating, you're implicating yourselves in serious international crimes and liability to the victims if you are supporting this. You can see the recommendations. There's a lot more in our Killing Spree report. If you Google Killing Spree WOLA, it's the first result you'll get. Be sure to put WOLA on, because if you search for Killing Spree, you'll get links to some really bad low budget horror movies. But the report is there and the recommendations are at the end.
Can I say just something very short related to
Absolutely.
what you were saying, Adam? We were able to report several governments announcing that they were not sharing any more information regarding criminal activities in the sea when they thought or they suspected they could be used for these bombings. So I think the US is less safe precisely because a lot of these collaborations are going back. They're not acting like we saw Dutch declarations from Netherlands, from the UK, from Canada, from France, which all have islands and links to a lot of the Caribbean nations. And they said, we're not going to share more information with you guys if this is what you're going to do, precisely to disentangle themselves from these possible gross violations. So I think that's something that more governments should be doing. Although for governments in Latin America, it's difficult. It's difficult given the circumstance, because retaliations can be very big.
Yeah, absolutely. Really important point, Maria Teresa. Thank you so much. So I'm going to invite all the panelists to come on video, and we're going to go into some of the Q&A, and it's not too late to add more into the Q&A box. I'll keep an eye on those. But I want to start. Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, can I add my recommendations?
Oh my God, I forgot you. Sarah, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Please go ahead and add your recommendations. Maria Teresa and Adam, I'll see you back on camera in a minute.
No,
Sarah,
stay
go
on camera.
ahead.
I like when y'all are on camera.
No, Sarah, I got too excited by the third state recommendation of Maria Teresa. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Y'all can stay on. Anyway, so my recommendations are actually like quite critical of Congress. Not only have they not done anything legislatively to oppose this, successfully oppose this, the communication strategy, I think, is completely wrong. Many of them are very quiet, even though they oppose what Trump is doing or they oppose the Trump administration. Or the things that they say about the boat strikes are incorrect, like calling the September 2nd boat strike a war crime for executing the shipwrecked, I think draws attention away. Well, first, it's incorrect because it's not a war crime because it didn't occur during an armed conflict. But two, it draws attention away from the fact that there is mass murders happening, or there have been mass murders happening across many months. All of these strikes are illegal. All of them are equally bad and murderous. And so when lawmakers focus attention on, the double tap, or they focus attention on the fishing boats, they are conceding territory to the narrative that Trump is pushing, this fake narrative that there is an armed conflict, and that the fishermen are innocent, but the people carrying drugs are bad and potentially combatants and lawfully able to kill. That's the implication. All of these are murder. So this is why I said at the top, even if you took the president's facts at face value, even if you assume there's drugs on every single one of these boats, they're all just as illegal as if they were executing fishermen. It's exactly the same under the law. So Congress needs to make that very clear. There needs to be lawmakers who are full-throated in their conviction against what the military is doing and supportive of human rights and talking about human rights law and peacetime and what we do when we allege that somebody has committed a crime. We don't execute them. We don't take their life. And at the apex of rogue government action is the arbitrary taking of life, right? Like that is the pinnacle of rogue government action. And that's what we're seeing here. And Congress needs to act like it. And I don't see anyone truly acting like it in a way that really emphasizes human rights and due process. And that's what I would like to see. So first, communicate it. And the reason why it's important to communicate it is because if you want to build momentum for an accountability effort down the road, you have to identify the crime. So you can't keep talking about a war or saying you need to come to Congress for these authorities. Congress shouldn't be authorizing these strikes anyway. So there shouldn't be a debate. Congress already spoke on these issues. They spoke on these issues in Title 18, and they spoke on these issues in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and they need to make that clear. I think many of them are scared to look weak on drugs. I think that's silly because this is bad drug policy. It's actually like very bad drug policy and hasn't, as Adam described, done anything to stem the flow of cocaine or fentanyl or any other drugs that are potentially harming Americans. And then they also are worried about being too harsh on the military, to which I would say, as a former DOD lawyer, this is actually quite harmful for the military. It's harmful for their morale. It's harmful for their reputation. It's harmful strategically. It's very bad for our armed forces to be out there committing mass murder. And so if a lawmaker wants to protect them, they need to speak out against this. So those are my hopes for Congress. And then obviously long-term accountability measures are very important. And in the short term, we need to build that momentum. And to do that, we need to call these what they are: murder and crimes against humanity. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Those are all so important. I am horrified that I almost missed them. So thank you so much. And now, Adam and Maria Teresa, feel free to come back on camera, and I will go to a few Q&A questions. I recognize we are getting close to time, but there are a lot of really important questions in the chat. So we'll go, I think, a few extra minutes for those who can stick around. I'm going to start with a question about narratives and the different lenses through which we can look at this issue, because I see a few different questions that I'm going to kind of combine here. So one is around, what narrative strategies, as you mentioned, Maria Teresa, and what kinds of evidence do we think is important to collect, and how to press for those stories to be able to tell stories about the victims, given a lot of the fear that we're seeing. I also have questions on the other side of the narrative in the US about kind of what angles are most important to build more, public opposition, and particularly Republican opposition. You mentioned, Adam, that it was a pretty partisan vote, for example, and to, increase public concern for these strikes. There was also finally a comment around the role, for example, of the Pope or the Vatican. So thinking also about how you think about different constituencies, faith-based groups and others, and how they see these strikes. So I'm fitting a bunch of questions into one, but really what it comes down to is I'm going to invite each of you to just speak a little bit, or anyone who wants to jump in, to speak a little bit about what is compelling to people and what stories can be told more to make people aware of how terrible these strikes are. Maria Teresa, I see you off mute, so please go ahead.
Okay. I think that one of the things that I think it's super important, and is what we try to do, is that we could collaborate much more among civil society, among media, to tell these stories, because you can tell the stories, but they get lost because there's a massive amount of information about everything, and especially there's a massive amount of official information and very loud information about the official truths of the US right now. So I think that if we get together, this team that we put together with CLIP, it's El Clip, and if people want to read our stories, it's elclip.org, O-R-G. It's we need to do this. I think if we could collaborate more with American journalists and with American newspapers, I think we could actually get much further and do a lot more reporting about these stories, and especially have them be more noticed by the public, because it's very difficult that the public can see that. It is difficult to get people on video, which is the most compelling of all narratives, because people can see the real life of poor people where they live. We've tried it, it's very difficult, but I think we have to keep trying. And I think the more of us joining forces to tell these stories, the better.
Thank you so much. Adam and Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that question?
Just put a quick pin in what Maria Teresa said. I mean, I do a lot of WOLA's work on the border and migration as well. And you've had things like, family separation, ICE killings, conditions in detention centers. And, there's a lot of statistics. There's a lot of terrifying statistics about how many families are being separated and things like that. But often you have to hear from the people, and they have to be humanized, and people have to be willing to, and able, not even willing, able to tell their stories and put a human face on it. Obviously one of the bigger examples was the 2018 family separation crisis, when audios of crying kids and photos of kids crying for their parents made it into the mainstream. And next thing you know, you have Laura Bush writing letters and Rachel Maddow breaking down on MSNBC. And that moved public opinion in a way that it frequently doesn't when everybody is kept faceless. And keeping people faceless is what these policies really depend on. We can't let that happen. And I really, the CLIP and Maria Teresa did more than anybody so far to actually go to some of these often very insecure, dangerous areas to talk to the relatives and find out their stories as much as they could. But frankly, we're talking about 220 something victims, and we really only know, between Maria Teresa and the CLIP's efforts and those of a few other news organizations, maybe the names of 30 of the victims so far. It's dangerous. There are authoritarian governments, and quite often both NGOs and news organizations are hollowed out. We don't have the resources that we had even 10 or 20 years ago to do this like in-depth field work to find people and make it find a safe space to talk to them. We have to do more. Some of that will require resources, even just to coordinate better.
I think the most impactful narrative is hearing human stories. I think also lawmakers can evoke history and why do we have these laws? Why do we prevent these things, right? Why does the United States have such a bedrock of due process as part of our identity? And it's because we didn't want a monarchy to just execute our people for any reason, right? We wanted protections, and that's why that's in our Constitution. And then why did we create these human rights frameworks after, the post-world order? And why did we really want to limit state power to take life? Because we've seen so much horror and atrocity. And so I think that has to be part of the narrative. It's like there are like human reasons behind the laws that we have to protect life, right? And we've lived through this, and we don't want to continue to live through this. And so I think in addition, I think first and foremost, put forward the stories of the people who are being affected, their families, their friends, their communities. I think it's why we all do the work that we do. It's because it's the impact on human life. And then, and then when you talk about the law, make it tie it to, the fact that this is really terrible things that we've seen in the past, and we're trying to prevent them. Anyway, I completely agree. Maria Teresa, your work has been so amazing and moving, and I look forward to seeing more.
Thank you, Sarah and Adam.
You're muted, Annie.
Well, that's just moderator 101, isn't it? Thank you all so much. I'm going to take at least one more question. And Adam, I believe this one is for you, but also welcome others to jump in as well. I have a question from Beatriz Pascual from TVE in Spain. The question is, you mentioned the recent announcement that Panama, Colombia, and Honduras could allow joint U.S. military operations against criminal groups on their territory, something Ecuador is already doing. In historical terms, how significant is this development? Does it represent a departure from the kind of security cooperation we have seen in recent years? And are there historical parallels that come to mind?
Sure. I mean, the countries we know that Hegseth said, I should say, that have agreed to this arrangement, and in addition to Colombia and Ecuador, are Guatemala, Honduras, and Jamaica. And Guatemala has been sort of going back and forth about the real extent to how much they've allowed or they're going to allow. But if we're going to know more in a few months. But if Secretary Hegseth and others in that small circle in the Trump administration were to just wave a magic wand and get everything they wanted out of these agreements, you would have U.S. personnel on the ground engaged in combat, if either kicking in doors or dropping the bombs, always alongside and in coordination somehow with local forces. And that is qualitatively different from what we saw even during the Cold War. There were a few brief U.S. invasions where U.S. troops were involved in combat in Latin America, Dominican Republic 1965, Panama 1989, Grenada 1983. But for the most part, U.S. assistance to militaries in the region to fight communists or for the drug war was indirect. We would give money, we would give weapons and equipment and training and intelligence to other militaries, often with very bad human rights records, who then went on and did the killing, but generally U.S. troops were not involved. In Colombia, during the Plan Colombia period, U.S. troops and contractors were very close to the front. They were very close to the combat on the perimeter, but I don't know of any case of a U.S. soldier actually firing his weapon and killing a Colombian citizen on Colombian soil. If this framework, this joint operations framework, were to actually take the form that I think that Hegseth and others would like it to take, you would see that kind of thing happening with them firing their weapons. So a lot of it's going to be up to the host nations themselves about what they will permit.
There is just to say, there is a recent, I think it just came out, so I haven't read it, from Human Rights Watch regarding attacks on land in Ecuador with the U.S. aid, U.S. support. I'm not sure if there's, to what extent is the involvement of the U.S., because I haven't read the report yet.
Yeah, they were on the perimeter of an operation in March and helped with the targeting and the intelligence that was a raid of what they thought was an armed group encampment, but may in fact have been a dairy farm. But there are joint operations going on near the Colombian border right now.
Thank you all so much. We are over time, which is too bad because I see a lot of important questions here. So Jeff, in the forum, it sounds like you just need to schedule another one of these for more discussion. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up just to be cognizant of all of your time and just say Huge thank you to all of our amazing panelists. Thank you to everyone who tuned in for this. There is going to be a quick survey that's going to pop up in a moment when you exit. Please take that. That helps us and the forum make sure that events are helpful and impactful in the future. And follow-up resources will also be emailed and available online very soon. And we'll keep in mind some of the questions that we saw here as well to inform those resources. So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Maria Teresa, Adam, Sarah, and of course, Jeff in the forum for hosting, and hope you are all well.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Annie. Thank you all for attending.